want to give you a picture of what was happening in the 19th century to kind of set the stage for the pronouncement of the Bab that he is the promised one of Islam. This was an age of change. In 1844, the telegraph sent its first message. Machines eliminated the need for slavery completely, as we mentioned before, by the beginning of this century. Food production had become so advanced that a population of the world that remained fairly constant at around 200 million people for nearly 1,000 years exploded fivefold to 1 billion people by 1840s. Transportation had been revolutionized by the invention of the steam engine. In 1930, there were only 20 miles of railway in England. By 1840, there were 300 miles. And towards the end of the 19th century, almost every region of Europe and the America was reached by train. The patent office in the 1830s closed because Congress decided there were no more things to be invented. By 1848, there were more patents to be filed that were sitting on the patent office desk than all previous patents put together. In the year 2000, there were more patents filed than the previous 3 years. The rate and increase of patent filings has not diminished and will continue to explode. By the end of the 19th century, the 3- and 5-phase electric motor, as well as the ability to generate electrical power, had been invented by Tesla and developed by Edison. The electric light bulb had been invented, as well as the fluorescent lamp. In fact, the first demonstration of remote control robotics had been demonstrated in the 1890s at the Chicago Fair. In 1844, Darwin would publish his revolutionary paper on evolution that we discussed earlier. And in 1863, he would print his first book called The Origin of Species. Freud would base a new psychotherapy upon the Hindu teachings that we discussed before, and revolutionized the way people looked at psychology. In religion and philosophy, Christianity fulfilled an ancient prophecy by having encircled the world by the middle of the 1800s in terms of missionary work. It was upon completion of having circled the globe that Christ was to return. The Pope, after receiving a tablet from Baha'u'llah, decided to increase his authority and declared himself for the first time to be infallible. So the infallibility of the Pope came in the 1870s. He also established the first ecumenical movement, which, as we know, completely failed. There was at this time a rise in spiritualism in the West. There was a hunger for something different than the dogma and the doctrine of the Christian church. And so spiritualism began to enter all the parlors of Europe and America. These are the seances by which you talk to the dead through a medium. Eastern philosophies became popular through the translation into English of the Bhagavad Gita and the Buddhist writings and other Eastern philosophies. This was also the rise of apocalyptic religions and simultaneously of fundamentalism. See, apocalyptic religions and fundamentalism always increase prior to a new revelation. It is an attempt to re-energize, to find the roots of a religion that has lost its spiritual impetus. Social movements were created. The Red Cross and other charities, labor unions began because of the abuses of the Industrial Revolution. The first compulsory education was inaugurated both in Europe and the United States. In 1838, the Queen of England abolished slave trade, was the first of the modern countries to do so. She would be later congratulated on that by Baha'u'llah himself in a tablet. Later, France abolished slavery. And then also in 1861 or late 1850s, Russia abolished slavery. Not to be outdone by any of the others, the U.S. was the last to abolish slavery with the Emancipation Act. Australia became the first country to give full civil rights to prisoners who had completed their sentences. Today in the United States, we still have 13 states that do not give any civil rights to people after they completed their prison sentences. The first multilateral limits on warfare at the Geneva Convention in 1863 put into effect what Islam had given as limits of warfare as far back as 650 AD. They just did it 1,200 and some years later. There were many ancient prophecies who were awaiting the coming of the Promised One. The Hinduism, the reincarnation of Lord Krishna, the fifth and most great Buddha. The second and third Zoroastrian messiahs were to come. The Jewish Messiah would appear when the homeland would be restored. That was, as far as we know, that perhaps could be identified with the year 1844 when there was an edict of tolerance between Turkey and England that would allow the Jews to return to their homeland. Even Plato himself said, God will appear again and resume the reins of the empire. Christianity prophesied the Spirit of truth would come and reveal all truth. Islam, the Qayyim of Shia Islam, and the Spirit of Jesus for Sunnis would come. The Aztecs were awaiting Quetzalcoatl to return in 1844 and bring a new spiritual order in the 13th era. The Mayans were expecting Shalom Balam in 1863. New religions were being formed, so-called apocalyptic religions. The Latter-day Saints were established, or Mormons, by Joseph Smith to prepare his people for the second coming. The Millerites, or Seventh-day Adventists, prepared by selling all of their possessions. And around 1843, they went up, I think, on a hill in Philadelphia to await the coming of the Promised One, of Jesus. They wore white sheets. After waiting up there for a number of weeks, they went back home disappointed. Dr. Miller, who was the leader of this new movement, said he made a miscalculation of Daniel's prophecy and decided it was not 1843 but 1844. So they sold their homes again and all their possessions, put their white sheets on, and went up to the same hill and waited for Christ to come out of the clouds with the angels rank upon rank and the trumpets a blasting. The Templars in 1860s left their homes in Germany and moved to the bottom of Mount Carmel, awaiting the return of Christ. On top of their doors they put, "God is near." Today, if you go to the bottom of Mount Carmel, you will find many of the same Templar homes with the same saying, they're still awaiting the return of Jesus. And as you walk out their door and look up Mount Carmel, you see the magnificent Baha'i shrines. By the time the end of 1844 came, the press had as headlines, 1844, the year of disappointment. In 1871, the U.S. Congress created an act which read, "The Redeemer will come if he's not already here." 16 Native American tribes believed that the Messiah would come prior to the end of the 19th century to America. While all this is happening, we have to trace a little bit further back. There was a new movement created, started by a holy man named Sheikh Ahmad. He was an Arab who was a Muslim. And he began to teach his followers that not to take the Quran or the Bible literally, that most of what was there was figuratively or symbolic. And he began to explore the meanings, because he said that the resurrection that was referred to in the Quran is not physical, and that the literal interpretation blinded the clergy from recognizing the truth. And so his purpose was to prepare his students to recognize the fulfillment of the Shia prophecy, the Qayyam. He died, and his primary student, who was a descendant of Muhammad. A descendant of Muhammad is designated by a title called Sayyid. And they also wear a green turban, a light green turban. And Sayyid Kazem carried on the work of his teacher and began preparing his students to recognize the Qayyam, which he said was imminent. His primary student was a clergy called a mullah. A mullah is like a rabbi. They study the Quran and they attempt to live the life. And Mullah Hossein was in his early 20s, as well as most of the followers. And Sayyid Kazem explained to them that you must independently recognize the Qayyam, the Qayyam. That you must search with your own eyes, discover, and then you can't tell your companions. But these are the questions that you must ask the Qayyam when you meet him in order to verify if he is the promised one. And he gave instructions. On the eve of May 22nd, 1843-44, Mullah Hussein was at the gates of a city of Shiraz, which is in the southern part of Iran, searching for the promised one. While he was gazing through the gates, Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, decided on that evening to send the first telegraph message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. He asked a woman to send that message and to choose the selection to do that. She decided to choose a passage from the Bible, Numbers 23:23, "What hath God wrought?" While she was tapping out this message in Morse code, inaugurating the first digital transmission of the modern digital age, because you know the dots and dashes are digital. Mullah Hussein recognizes the young man called the Bab. His name was Muhammad Ali. He was also a descendant of Muhammad. He wore a green turban. And the young Bab, with name that he later acquired, meaning the gate, invited Mullah Hussein up to his house and spent the entire evening into the night with him. Mullah Hussein, as instructed, requested that he comment on this chapter we talked about earlier in the Quran called the chapter of Joseph, the Surah of Joseph. Remember, Joseph was the young prophet who became a king, and his father recognized him by the fragrance of his garment. And the Bab wrote speedily and without error in a way that proved that he must be not of this world, and began to write the first chapters of a book that would be later called the Qayyum al-Azma. And the first chapter would be this commentary on the Surah of Joseph. Mullah Hussein describes that night of unsurpassed felicity and joy, transcending the concerns of this world, and recognized the Bab as the promised one of Islam. The Bab reminded him to not tell his peers that they must independently recognize him. In the next 40 days, 18 of the disciples of Sayyid Kazem would recognize the Bab. The last two I want to spend a little time on. The 17th was the only woman of that first group. Her name was Tahereh. She was already well known in Persia for her poetry. In fact, her poetry was well known in Europe. She was a brilliant woman who was a recent divorcee. But she was also an expert on the Quran and its traditions, so much so that the high clergy would come to her house and ask her difficult questions so that they could return to their congregations and pretend that they had discovered these answers. In order not to remind themselves that they were talking to a woman, they would always put her behind a black curtain while asking her the questions, and when she gave the answers, so they wouldn't have to look at her. She dreamt one evening that she was read a tablet, a beautiful tablet that she had never heard, the like of which she had never heard before. One day, she had someone read a tablet from the Bab. Someone who had been with the Bab read a tablet that he had written, and she recognized it was the same as that was she had remembered in her dream. And she said, that is the promised one. And so Tahereh, the only woman, recognized the Bab and never met him. The last was a young man named Qudus. He was the 18th. The Bab so loved Qudus because Qudus recognized him by the way he walked. He had an intuition, an innate, almost understanding that enabled him to recognize the Bab. The Bab would take Qudus on his Hajj or pilgrimage, and Qudus would be considered by the Bab the fruit of Islam on the male side, and Tahireh would be considered the fruit of Islam on the female side, as Mary was the fruit of Judaism on the female side, and John the Baptist the fruit on the male side. After all 18 had recognized the Bab, he gave them a speech and a tablet that would remind one of the speech that Christ gave his disciples to go out and teach the faith of God through love and kindness and understanding, and not by coercion. In fact, when you read this tablet of the Bab, you can easily visualize Jesus giving the same words to his disciples. These disciples then went out and they taught with such love and with such enthusiasm and passion that it set the entire country aflame. Within a very short period of time, unprecedented in the history of religion, a large percentage of the population became sympathetic to the Bab, perhaps as high as 10%. The clergy, in collusion with the government, became alarmed because this new movement threatened the stability of their stronghold that they held over the people. So they decided to imprison the Bab. And so they brought the Bab up to the prison city of Sharik, or Maku, excuse me, which is in the northern part of the country, where he stayed for approximately 2 years. In Maku, during that period, it is estimated that the Bab wrote 500,000 verses. When you consider that the Quran is 6,000 verses, and the Bible approximately the same, it gives you an idea of the magnitude of his revelation. Most of these verses were either destroyed or lost. However, God always protects the revelation from arbitrary destruction, and that which remained was essential. That which was lost was not. You see, Moses went up to the mountain a second time to reveal another set of commandments because the people weren't ready for the first set. They were too immature. It's my understanding that things are destroyed or lost even by the enemies are things that are either replaced or they were not essential. People were not ready for it. But regardless of what the reasons were, it was a prolific period that religious history had never experienced before. The guards at Maku became friends of the Bab. They fell in love with the Bab. Anytime the Bab wished, he could go outside of the prison and mix with his followers. Instead of causing a decrease in the fervor of the faith, the number of new adherents, and plus the fire, the general enthusiasm, the number of disturbances that were occurring was only increasing. The government, in collaboration with the clergy, decided they needed to move the Bab to even a further, more remote prison called Sharik. Sharik was so remote from the rest of Iran that you needed a Sherpa to get to it. And during his time at Sharik, which was perhaps one of the most difficult times of the Bab's ministry, because it was during his stay at Sharik that he learned of the systematic execution of his followers. His most beloved disciples were being systematically either assassinated or killed, including the first to recognize him, Mullah Hussein, and then Qudus, as well as some 10,000 others, and eventually 20,000. So horrific, so disturbing were the ways in which these people were executed and tortured that diplomats from other countries would write back to their governments and request to be removed from this barbaric country. At one point, the Bab, because the messengers have both a human as well as a divine side, could not get out of bed for 2 months under the weight of this news. Baha'u'llah, in a book he would write later called the Book of Certitude, would say, if all of the hearts of humanity were to be placed in a single heart, it would not suffice to endure what the Bab endured. You see, my friends, there are many ways in which a messenger of God suffers. It is not just by having nails driven into your hand. In fact, it's my belief that the greatest suffering of a messenger of God has nothing to do with his physical torture. The greatest suffering is their all-knowing awareness of the potential of human nobility, and watching, in contrast to that potential, the degraded and abased behavior of mankind. That is the true suffering. In no less degree than a parent suffers when they see the potential of their child be thrown away out of ignorance and out of rebelliousness. But the faith continued to grow in intensity. It was finally decided that only one thing could stop the faith from growing, and that would be to cut off its head. In other words, to execute the Bab. So they brought the Bab down from the mountain city of Sharik and paraded him through all the towns on his way where people would show abuses. You know, humanity is very fickle. One day they'll love you, and the next day they throw rocks at you. And as they brought him to the city in which he was to be executed, the fortress city of Tabriz, there was a young teenager by the name of Anis who had dreamt that he would be with the Bab. And he escaped the confinement of his house because his father would not want to be there. And he then moved his way through the crowds so he could see the Bab being paraded by, and when the Bab came by, he wrapped himself around the feet of the Bab and pleaded with him that he be executed along with the Bab. And the Bab agreed. And they brought both Anis and the Bab to the fortress, and they put them in different prison cells, and the Bab was giving his last instructions to his secretary. While he was doing that, one of the guards came in, or the captain of the regiment that was to execute him came in. His name was Captain Sam Khan. And he came in and he requested that the Bab forgive him because he could not understand why the Bab was tried and found guilty. He didn't know what he was guilty of. And he felt in his heart a great weight of having to execute the Bab. And the Bab assured him that he should carry out his duty and carry through with the execution. See, Sam Khan was a Christian, and his regiment was a Christian regiment. The Muslim hierarchy and the government of Iran chose a Christian regiment because there was a prophecy from one of the imams that it would be the Iranians themselves that would kill the promised one. So that if there was a slight chance that the Bab was the promised one, they wanted to use a Christian regiment so at least they would fulfill that prophecy. Then the guards came in to get the Bab while he was dictating a letter through his secretary. And the guard said, "It is now time for the execution." The Bab turned to him and said, "I am not ready, and no power on earth can stop me from what I need to do." And I'm paraphrasing. They took the Bab anyway. They brought him out into the courtyard, and along with the niece, they chained him up against the wall. Sam Khan then took his regiment, which consisted of 750 rifles, put them in 3 rows of 250 rifles apiece, musket-loaded rifles. You see, musket-loaded means, what's it called? Is it breech-loaded or musket-loaded? Breech-loaded. Meaning, muzzle-loaded, yeah, muzzle-loaded. So you put, your powder in, then you put a wad, then you put your half-inch lead ball and another wad. Creates a lot of smoke when they go off. Actually, it was an archaic weapon by this time. And so the first round of 250 rifles fired, the second round of 250 rifles fired, the third round of 250 rifles fired. The amount of lead that was directed to the Bab at near the speed of sound was equivalent to a small cannonball. After the smoke finally cleared from the courtyard, and you have to understand, this was a modern execution. There were newspaper reporters. There were photographs. There were people all over. There were representatives of governments. And as the smoke lifted, the Bab had disappeared. There was no body. And the young man stood, though in amazement, unscathed. So there was pandemonium. Where did the Bab go? And they searched wide and far for the Bab. Had he escaped? Was this a conspiracy? And finally, one of the guards found the Bab back in his cell, completing the letter to his secretary. And after he completed the letter, he then looked at the guard. He says, "Now I am ready." Sam Khan then turned to the authorities and said, "I've completed my obligation, I'm out of here," and took his regiment with him. This caused great confusion because they had now to find another regiment, but there wasn't another Christian regiment. They had to use a Muslim regiment. In other words, they had to fulfill the prophecy of one of the imams. So they brought the Muslim regiment in, and this time the 750 rifles, the impact caused the 2 bodies of Anis and the Bab to literally mesh together. The impact was so great. Miraculously, the faces were untouched. The authorities then took the body down and put guards around it so that the followers of the Bab could not retrieve the body and give it a proper burial, and the bodies would be consumed by animals, which is a form of denigration. Through the night, however, mysteriously, the followers of the Bab were able to retrieve the bodies, and they put them in hiding. They would remain in hiding for nearly 60 years. And finally, they found their way through the directions of the son of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, to Mount Carmel to find their final resting place. Following the execution of the Bab, one of the last of the disciples to be executed was Tahirih. And for that event, she brought out her old wedding dress, made herself beautiful for her true beloved, and found the most beautiful scarf she could to give to the executioner to strangle her. And while he was putting the scarf around her neck, she exclaimed, "You might be able to kill me, but you will not stop the emancipation of women." And she was then strangled to death and thrown into a well, and rocks were thrown on top of her. A few years later, Baha'u'llah, one of the primary followers of the Bab, was put in with other followers into a dark dungeon at the bottom of Tehran. And in this filth that they had to live and sleep and eat, Baha'u'llah receives his revelation that he is the promised one that the Bab had foretold. Because in the Bab's writings, he said, though he brings an independent revelation, it is to prepare the people for the revelation to come after him. So I leave the end of this lecture with Baha'u'llah in the Sea of Chal in the dungeon below Tehran, and we'll continue after a short break.